King Philip II himself broke open the door to his son's bedroom. He did not come as a father, but as a general, fully armored as if leading an invasion. Prince Don Carlos, heir to the world's most powerful empire, was jolted from his sleep and saw armed guards in his bedroom, with his own father standing among them. The king's face was a mask of cold duty, his eyes unreadable behind his steel visor. In that chilling moment, the prince understood that this was not just a lecture, not a punishment, but an arrest. The man who had given him life had now come to take away his freedom. A king's duty was about to erase a father's love. This moment of familial betrayal would echo throughout the courts of Europe. But how did this happen? To understand how a king could become the jailer of his only son and heir, we must trace it back to a royal birth seen as both a divine miracle and a terrible hidden curse. Before Don Carlos ever took a breath, he was already a prisoner of his own blood. The year was 1545, and whispers of the coming heir filled the Spanish royal palace. But behind closed doors, royal physicians exchanged worried glances. They understood something the jubilant courtiers didn't. This child was the product of a bloodline so intertwined, so obsessively pure, that it had become poison. Here's what pure meant for the Habsburg family. Carlos had just 6 great-grandparents. Only 6. A normal person has 16. Think about that for a moment. 10 of his ancestors had been erased through generations of uncles marrying nieces, first cousins marrying first cousins, all in the name of keeping the crown's blood untouched by outsiders. The family tree wasn't branching, it was strangling itself. The court scribes recorded his birth with joyful flourish, but they couldn't record the invisible damage that was encoded in his very cells. When Carlos was born on July 8, 1545, the midwives noted that his head seemed oddly shaped and his cries were weaker than expected. But he was alive, and he was a boy, and that was enough for celebration. His mother, Maria Manuela of Portugal, held him only once. She was barely 17, exhausted from a brutal delivery that had torn her body apart from the inside. 4 days, that was all Maria had to be a mother before the infection claimed her life. While the court celebrated the birth of the heir, the same bells tolled for Maria's funeral. The infant prince, wrapped in silk and unaware of his loss, had already lost his first, most precious bond. And here's the darkest part. Maria wasn't just Carlos's mother. She was also his first cousin. Their fathers were brothers, their mothers sisters. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a genetic echo chamber. The very blood that killed Maria now flowed through Carlos, carrying with it the accumulated damage of generations. King Philip, barely 20 years old himself, stood at his wife's funeral holding his infant son. The courtiers saw a grieving widower with his heir, but Philip saw something else. He saw the cost of purity. His son had survived, yes, but at what price? And more terrifying still, what hidden costs were yet to be paid? Royal children's struggles are often seen as minor issues, but what was happening with Prince Carlos was anything but ordinary. The court physicians reassured King Philip that the child would soon grow strong. After all, he had the blood of kings, the blood of conquerors, who had claimed half the world for Spain. Surely this bloodline would lead him to greatness. But they had no idea how wrong they were. The blood of kings was the very issue. After generations of intermarriage, each generation became part of an invisible chain, and Carlos brought all of that burden within him. The famous Habsburg jaw, that visible deformity, was just the outward sign of the deeper damage hiding inside. What lay beneath was far worse. It wasn't a mystical curse. It was mathematics, a genetic game with increasingly terrible odds, and Carlos had already lost before he ever had the chance to play. Every cell in his body carried the accumulated failures of his ancestors, their pride in keeping the power within the family at any cost. Carlos had fought against the odds at birth, a motherless prince born into genetic captivity. But his bloodline's curse wasn't just a number in a family tree. Soon, he would show the world that this genetic chain was imprinted in his very bones. The royal armourer was sweating as he tried to fit the breastplate, made from the finest Milan steel. It simply wouldn't fit. He had measured the prince's body 3 times. Each measurement was more puzzling than the last. The left side of his torso curved inward where it should have expanded. His right shoulder sat nearly 2 inches higher than the left. No amount of reshaping or adjusting could fit this 13-year-old body that was so out of balance. The nurses reported troubling signs. The baby's feeding was erratic. His sleep patterns were chaotic. He would cry for hours without cause, then fall into a deathly silence that terrified the servants. One nurse swore she saw him stop breathing entirely for nearly a minute, before gasping back to life like a drowning man breaking the surface. Carlos stood there with his arms outstretched, while the armourer struggled to adjust the breastplate onto his body. The prince's breathing was fast and shallow, not from exertion, but because his muscles and chest were deformed, making it hard for his lungs to fully expand. Every breath was a struggle, as his misshapen ribs made it difficult for his lungs to take in air. The courtiers tried to ignore it, but Carlos could hear their whispers echoing off the stone walls. His physical deformities were becoming as obvious as the sins of his family. His skull had grown unevenly, bulging on one side, like a melon left too long in the sun. The palace artists had to use creative angles to hide his deformities in portraits. His left leg hadn't grown at the same rate as his right, which made him walk with a strange limp, and the sound of his footsteps scraping across the marble floors was hard to ignore. But here's the issue with the idea of divine right. In 16th century Spain, the king's body was considered a reflection of God's favour. A strong, balanced air was a sign of God's blessing. But what did Carlos's twisted body say about the Habsburg family? What did it say about Spain? Court physicians came up with explanations. They said the prince's body was unbalanced due to his humours. They blamed his stars for being misaligned at birth. But the truth was that the generations of intermarriages within the Habsburg family were the real cause of his condition. The treatments they recommended today would seem torturous. They wanted to drain his blood to balance his humours, give him mercury baths to straighten his spine, and fit him with specially made iron boots to help his shorter leg grow. Carlos endured all of it with anger, causing his servants to stay away from him. When the metal boots were removed each night, his screams of pain echoed through the palace hallways. It wasn't just the pain, it was his anger at his body betraying him. The royal tutors reported more troubling signs. Prince Carlos's attention was constantly wandering. He would focus on strange details, like the patterns in the cracks on the ceiling or the sound of his own breathing, while ignoring important lessons about state affairs. Sometimes he would speak quickly, and other times he wouldn't speak at all. Some days he spoke fluently and in a royal manner, but other days he could barely form sentences, as if his tongue couldn't keep up. Then there were the headaches, the crushing, world-ending pain that would send him to his room for days. The servants in the royal court would hear him banging his deformed skull against the stone walls, trying to relieve the pain with more pain. When he came out, his eyes were red, unfocused and lifeless, as if he wasn't seeing our world, but some dark and unreal place. Marriage proposals started coming when Carlos turned 14. Royal families from across Europe sent portraits of their daughters, each hoping to form an alliance with Spain's vast empire. But Philip kept refusing, making excuses. How could he send honest descriptions of his son? How could he explain that the heir to the throne couldn't stand up straight, couldn't breathe properly, and didn't even dress like a true Spanish prince? The ambassadors who met Carlos sent secret messages back to their courts. They wrote that the prince showed signs of weakness. His physical condition appears delicate, they wrote carefully. They didn't have the courage to say the truth, that the heir to the Spanish throne looked like something broken and put back together wrong, like a porcelain doll that had been reassembled by a blind craftsman. There were some rumours and theories among the courtiers. Some believed that Carlos's physical deformities were a curse from his mother's spirit, born from an unnatural marriage. Others said that you could see the sins of his ancestors in his body. Each deformity was a sign of a generation's pride, the pride that led them to sacrifice genetic purity for the sake of maintaining the family's power. But far darker than his physical deformities, something monstrous was growing inside him. A brutal, animalistic cruelty was taking root in the young prince, and it was about to reveal itself in the most terrifying way. One day, the royal shoemaker presented the boots with trembling hands. He had made a mistake, and little did he know that his punishment would be to eat the boots he had crafted. This was just a routine fitting in Carlos's room. The craftsman had worked on the boots for weeks, designing them to accommodate the prince's shorter leg. But when Carlos tried them on, the left boot was just slightly tight, enough to send him into a rage. The room, once elegant and serene, became a field of humiliation. "Eat them," Carlos commanded, his voice strangely calm. The shoemaker thought it was a joke, but the prince's eyes held no humour. "Cut them into pieces and eat them," Carlos repeated. The courtiers watched in horrified silence as the shoemaker, tears streaming down his face, pulled out his knife and began cutting the boots he had worked so hard on. The sound of the cutting filled the room, slow and deliberate, and then came the worst sound, the chewing, the sound of crushing leather, as a man was forced to chew the very product of his labor. But this is where things truly became horrifying. It wasn't an isolated incident. It had turned into a pattern. The palace kitchen staff shared stories that even experienced soldiers found disturbing. Carlos had developed a fascination with watching animals die, not hunting, which was considered noble, or even slaughtering, which was necessary for food, but pure suffering. He would order live rabbits to be brought into his room, then roast them alive on his fireplace, timing how long their screams lasted. The servants who cleaned his room would find the burned bodies of the rabbits arranged in strange patterns, as if Carlos was creating some kind of horrific art. One day, a young servant made fun of the prince's limp. Carlos heard it, as he always did, whether the mockery was real or just in his mind. That night, the boy was asleep in his bed when Carlos stood over him, holding a spoon he had taken from the dinner table. He moved quickly in the darkness. The only thing that saved the boy was Carlos's own deformed body, which caused him to lose his balance. The prince swung the spoon, but he fell, giving the boy enough time to escape and run out of the room, screaming. The situation was getting worse. During a meeting with Portuguese diplomats, Carlos suddenly grabbed a knife from the dinner table and placed it against one of the ambassadors' throats. He demanded that the ambassador admit that Spain was superior to Portugal. The ambassador, who had been trained in careful diplomacy, was now terrified as he saw the madness in Carlos's eyes. King Philip had to step in personally, talking to his son in a calm manner, almost like trying to tame a wild animal. The most terrifying thing in the court was not how often he resorted to violence. The real fear came from how strategically he used his cruelty. He knew exactly who he could hurt without facing any consequences. He always targeted those who had no power to resist, like servants, craftsmen, or anyone without political influence. When high-ranking nobles were around, he played the role of a pained but manageable prince, but as soon as they left, his mask would drop. The royal physicians offered their explanations. They said the prince's temperament was unbalanced, and his mental stress caused him to explode in fits of rage. They believed his malformed brain was the cause of his violent tendencies. But privately, even they doubted whether this madness came from his physical condition, or if it was something deeper, a fundamental evil that would have existed even in a healthy body. His father, Philip, tried everything. Priests were brought in to pray over Carlos. The finest minds in Europe were consulted. Complex routines were established to control the prince's worst impulses, but nothing worked. If anything, their attempts to control him only led him further into brutality. The servants had devised a system. Whenever Carlos's footsteps echoed in the corridors, his distinctive limp warned everyone. Chambermaids would abandon their duties. The kitchen boys would hide in the pantries. Even the guards would find urgent work elsewhere. The heir to the throne had turned into a monster that everyone fled from. Prince Carlos was so unstable that he had become a threat, but he was still manageable, still containable. However, it was at this point that his father dealt him a psychological blow so personal and humiliating that it turned Carlos's anger into a raging fire. The eyes of every person in the Spanish court were fixed on the new queen, Elizabeth of Valois, but Prince Carlos looked at her with something else, a burning hatred that one finds in the eyes of a man who sees something taken from him. This betrayal was a masterpiece of political maneuvering. Elizabeth had originally been promised to Carlos as part of a peace treaty. For months, the prince had focused on her portrait, memorizing every detail of the beautiful French princess who was to be his wife. But Philip had other plans. The king, recently widowed, needed a queen for Spain, not a future princess. In a stunning reversal that shocked European courts, Philip married Elizabeth himself. The wedding that day became a painful form of art. Carlos was ordered to attend, forced to stand in clothes that hid his physical deformities. While watching his father marry the woman who was supposed to be his, Elizabeth was radiant, young, beautiful, everything Carlos could never be. When she spoke her vows to Philip, Carlos saw them as theft. Every word she spoke to his father had once been meant for him. This was the most tormenting part for Prince Carlos. Elizabeth treated him with kindness, not out of love but perhaps out of pity or guilt. She called him dear cousin and included him in the court's activities. But her kindness was like a sharp knife cutting through Carlos's heart. Every smile from her created a tightness in his chest. Every moment of compassion reminded him that he could never have her. This psychological torment played out daily in the court. During state dinners, Carlos was forced to sit at the high table, forced to watch his father and Elizabeth together. Philip's hand rested comfortably on Elizabeth's, and they exchanged quiet words in French, a language Carlos struggled with due to his speech issues. Their shared glances were a reminder of the marriage bed that should have been his. Carlos's resentment grew like a cancer. He began following Elizabeth's daily routines wherever he could. When she walked in the gardens, he trailed behind her, his uneven footsteps echoing with a soft scrape on the marble floors. The court would laugh at the sound of his footsteps, knowing that the prince was desperately trying to hide his physical deformities. He began sending Elizabeth strange, unsettling gifts. Not ordinary gifts, but things like live birds brought into her room, only to be slowly roasted alive. Their screams counted for time. The servants cleaning his room reported seeing the charred remains of the animals, arranged in bizarre patterns as if they were some twisted form of art. Prince Carlos's mental state was continuously deteriorating, and the servants in the palace began sharing even more terrifying stories about him. One day, he called live rabbits into his room and burned them, enjoying their screams while timing how long they lasted. Fear and terror about him began to echo throughout the palace, and his lameness became a part of his identity. This had become yet another tragic reality in his life. When foreign ambassadors came to meet Carlos, they described him as frail, weak, and physically delicate. Their reports referred to him as physically fragile and weak. But no one wrote what he truly was. A broken prince, one whose body had been reassembled, like a porcelain doll glued back together. Despite everything, Carlos's intention was to claim the Spanish throne. He considered himself the rightful heir and saw his father as incomplete and weak. This is the bitter truth of Carlos's story, which echoed not only in Spain, but also in the courts of Europe. Carlos's condition worsened to the point that when his footsteps echoed through the palace, the servants would immediately flee. One day, he told the shoemaker who had been measuring his shoes to eat them. This wasn't a minor incident, but rather a symbol of the growing madness inside him. The court members and officials were deeply concerned and fearful about his condition. Carlos's physical and mental state was continuously deteriorating, yet no help was available to him. King Philip, disregarding his son's condition, saw it as a mere minor incident, and his efforts to control him only made him more insane. King Philip kept his focus on the affairs of the empire, but when it came to his relationship with his son, he had emotionally detached himself. Carlos, already mentally fragile, began making plans against his father with a new and more dangerous intensity. Carlos's madness reached its peak when he began plotting to seize the throne. He devised a conspiracy against his father, but his deteriorating mental state completely altered the course of his life. He openly talked about betraying his father, believing it was essential for him to become the ruler of Spain. Now, Carlos had a new goal. He was ready to dethrone his father. He believed he had to win a war against his father to strengthen his own position, but both his body and mind were no longer on his side. Reports about his condition were increasing in the royal palace, and there were whispers about it throughout the court. The royal physicians had provided reports on his mental and physical decline, but King Philip was fully aware of the reality. King Philip knew that his son had become a major threat. He made an incredibly difficult decision to protect his empire, one that would be painful for him. He understood that imprisoning his son would be a hard and distressing action, but for the survival of the empire, it was a necessary decision. In the end, Philip had no choice but to imprison his son. Carlos had been involved in various plots against him, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions. For Carlos, being imprisoned by his own father was a tremendous disgrace, but for the king, this decision was essential for the survival of the kingdom. In prison, Carlos's condition rapidly deteriorated. His body grew weaker, and mentally, he became even more unstable. His suffering and anger were constantly expressed through his words, as he cursed his father. However, King Philip remained silent and did not react to his son's condition. He chose to remain indifferent. The king completely ignored his son's suffering. He not only dismissed Carlos's innocence, but also erased his name from history. A father had erased his son in such a way that history nearly forgot him. But Carlos's story wasn't entirely forgotten. 200 years later, his tale resurfaced, not only in Spain's history, but also in the writings of its enemies. Friedrich Schiller discovered fragments of Carlos's story and presented him not just as a mad prince, but as a romantic hero, destroyed by tyrannical rule. King Philip used every strategy to solidify his reign, and one of the first sacrifices he made for the survival of his empire was erasing his son's name from history. He removed his son's legacy, silencing his story so that no one would remember him. However, sometime later, that story came back to life, but in a different form. The truth was ignored, and it was presented in a new light. Schiller turned the tale into that of a romantic hero, and Verdi composed an opera that portrayed Don Carlos as a tragic lover, undone by fate. This was not the true story, but rather the version shaped by the creativity of the artists. The real Don Carlos, whose mind and body had deteriorated and who had turned into a monster, was nowhere to be found. His painful reality was lost in the past, while the imagined Carlos, beautiful and tragic, became immortal. Today, audiences around the world still weep at this tale in opera houses, remembering a prince who never existed. But the true Don Carlos, the one who suffered from his ailments and inner decay, was forgotten forever. King Philip silenced his son and erased his name, but his story never truly ended. It continues to be told today and will live on forever, even though efforts were made to remove the real character from history.